Thank you very much, Amanda. And I am very, 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 very glad to be here because the Meadows Museum is an institution, a world-famous institution of higher prestige, and to be here doing this lecture is an honor for me. Here at the Meadows Museum there is a remarkable collection of Catalan painting. You have a glittering work by Antoni Casanova Estorac, and 19th century international market painter. There are a lot of good works of Pere Daura, a very prominent painter who was part of the Cercle et Carré group in Paris, and who later settled in the United States, Virginia. You also have work of Rafael Duran Camps, and now also the Josep de Togores of the same generation. And here are also kept works by some of the basic members of the first international avant-garde generation, such as Joan Miró and the other world-great surrealist painter Salvador Dalí. And of the second one, such as Antoni Clavé, Ràfols Casamada, or Antoni Tàpies. Well, it's Antoni Casanova Estorac, Pere Daura, Miró, Dalí, Clavé. Well, but today, however, I will focus here on talking about a previous generation, the movement of Catalan Modernism, of which you also have a good selection of pieces in the museum, whose images will be seen in the PowerPoint included in my speech. Modernism was, in Catalan art, a trend of architectural origin. It's true that the yearning to approach European modernity was felt by the Catalan cultural world since the 80s of the 19th century, but it's also true that it was not spectacularly tangible until a few architects such as Antoni Gaudí, for instance, perhaps the most creative architect in the world at his time, or Lluís Domènech i Muntaner, did not begin to build in a radically new way even within that decade. Before modernism, Marià Fortuny, the painter of international prestige, who unfortunately died in his young years in 1874, had alternated a conventional bright style with a great commercial success throughout the world with modern-day flashes that nevertheless had only immediate transcendence in the more intimate circle of the artists. In fact, he is a herald of Catalan modernism, since in the most free paintings of his later period, Impressionism, which had not yet been officially born, already appeared. His Meadows seascape, a big partial sketch for his beach of Portici, also in the Meadows Museum, is undoubtedly one of his main works, without any anecdote more essential even than his splendid bullfights. The central group of the modernism. We find some samples of radical novelty in early works of Ramón Casas, such as Bullfight of 1884, where we can see unequivocal traces of Impressionism, which was held to the most modern worldwide pictorial style. Casas was the orthodox definer of pictorial Catalan modernism together with Santiago Rusiñol. Both were linked since their young age to the intellectual group of the magazine L'Avenç, which would be the conscious and militant motor of the cultural renovation of Catalonia, and therefore the impeller of modernism. Rusiñol and Casas made their most powerful appearance when they exhibited publicly in Barcelona what they had been painting in Paris around 1890, living together in the still not yet mythical Moulin de la Galette. Casas and Rusiñol's works at that time surprised the Catalan public, since they exhibited them at the Sala Parés in Barcelona in October 1890, besides those of their friend sculptor Enric Clarasó, who nevertheless did still not have an innovative accent like that of his friends, and in further exhibitions such as the General Fine Arts one in May 1891, or a new joint personal exhibition, again with the sculptor Clarasó, in November of the same year. The surprise came from the adoption of a style that had both naturalism and grey impressionism, very often at the service of absolutely no anecdotal reasons, at a time when it was thought that painting had no purely plastic values, but that it had to be a vehicle to explain something or even to instruct. The painters were not alone in Paris. They lived there with Miquel Utrillo, who only occasionally acted as a painter, becoming in turn one of the most active intellectuals of the movement and an untiring promoter of initiatives. In the weight achieved by Rusiñol and Casas at that time in Catalan artistic life, it had a great influence, no doubt, that those artists were not socially speaking strangers, but outstanding children of the Catalan bourgeoisie. From that moment on, Rusiñol and Casas enjoyed a very special visibility, which they would manage to keep on for a last during a decade, producing an intense, varied and highly visible works, which in the case of Rusiñol was stressed by combining it with a literary and theatrical career that would grant him a great popularity as well as a central role in the intellectual definition of the movement that already called modernism. Rusiñol was taking it so seriously that, with a bit of humor, he called it, the modernism, as the party. Casas always continued in the same aesthetic line of Verista concept, and in any case, the corrections which he introduced in his pictorial conceptions were to alternate his works of pure painting with other, larger ones, where he proposed narrating the social life of his country, from the Garroteville, the Casas, to his La Carga from 1999. Quite in the style of Casas, we will find Manuel Feliu de Lemus, a creator of very solid feminine types who lived in France. It is a similar case as that of Claudio Castelucho, who settled for life in Paris, where he ran a famous free artistic academy and one of the most present Catalan painters in the Parisian exhibitions scene. At Meadows, there is a magnificent female portrait painted by him. Rossinyol made a very strong turn in 1894, almost abandoning his objectivist style and adopting another one where symbolism had a great weight. The three allegorical ogival murals of poetry, painting, and music he did for his Cau Ferrat in Sitges were openly pre-Raphaelist. And since then, his painting would always be close to reverie. Some had speculated that this change of Rossinyol was directly linked to a certain desire of the artist to escape thorough dreams in view of the bitter evolution suffered by Catalan social life in those years of turmoil and anarchist bombs, which gave Barcelona a tragic fame through the wall. Meadows has now acquired a new work of Rossinyol, a magnificent garden located on the symbolic line that became more common in the mature Rossinyol career. This radical variation of Rossinyol's painting, however, did not affect the deeply modernist nature of the artist, since new symbolism it was such a paradigm of modernism at that more or less realistic impressionism which he had been cultivating in the years before. Because modernism was not a specific style, but a conscious renewal attitude that could be materialized in many ways and through different styles, as long as they had any novel connotations. Perhaps even closer to the modernist group of the magazine L'Avenç was Eliseu Meifrèn, an excellent painter, an extroverted artist, vital, basically a landscaper, and with an enormous personal mobility that led him to living, besides in Catalonia, in the Canary Islands, Mallorca, France, the Americas. Meifrèn, however, never expressed the same degree of innovative concern as his friends, although he aligned himself with Booth and with Utrillo and joined them in Els Quatre Gats, the cenacle tavern led by them in Barcelona, which centered the Catalan modernist cultural life at the turn of the century. Meifrèn was a professional painter, modern but not in excess. Once a critic objected that his landscapes were made in the workshop, not in plein air. His reply was a canvas with him painting on a boat, and he just called it my workshop. Darío de Regoyos was not a Catalan, but spent a much of his life connected to the most active pre-impressionist groups in Brussels. However, he lived and died in Catalonia, where he was the artistic manager of Luz in the final years of the century, one of the most characteristic journals of Modernisme, where he illustrated the famous Black Spain series, España Negra, written together with his friend, the Belgian writer Emil Verhaeren. His best work is possibly though in the Pyrenees, just here in the Meadows Museum. The symbolists. Among the painters who also announced new paths before Casas and Rossinyol was Aleix Clapés, a rare and sociable, independent man who already sets his unclassifiable art on the walls and doors of Antoni Gaudí's Palau Güell. He cooperated again with Gaudí 20 years later in the halls of La Pedrera building. Surely, Clapés was not as great as Gaudí as artist, but he was, however, as individualistic and different from his contemporaries as him, and it is clear that there were good personal relationships between them. If the misanthropic Gaudí ended up being consecrated as the genius of modernism, his pictorial collaborator Clapés, with his faded figures, his glittering compositions, and his often phantasmagoric approaches, so that we may also qualify him with a similar tack. The symbolism which, as we have seen, was adopted by Rossinyol suddenly, was not in any way an unusual style in the modernist Catalan art, but it was the other great flowing undercurrent of Catalan modernist painting. The great cultivator of this trend was Alexandre de Riquer, a multi-purpose creator who, apart from being a painter, was an all-terrain artist, designer, poster draftsman, and even a recognized poet. The kind of painting that Riquer practiced in this time of fullness, however, was very different from that of other modernists. He made more mural and decorative works than easel painting. His aesthetic approaches fitted exactly in the exuberant sinuosity, fantasy, and ornamentation typical of Art Nouveau, that style that triumphed overwhelmingly around the turn of the century. Riquer's militant Catholicism, besides, made him very inclined to religious painting, in which the representation of the mysteries of faith are formally fitted with certain approaches to symbolism. Even though the aesthetic source of most other modernist Catalan painters was French, that of Riquer must be placed especially in England, where he traveled in 1894 and had the opportunity of seeing there and getting to know the then triumphant pre-Raphaelism, which clearly influenced his compositions. Josep Maria Tamburini and Joan Brull also adorned themselves with the painting of symbolist themes in the mid-90s. Both of them, nevertheless, came from a certain conventionalism. They had both practiced in the 10 overall painting of historical subjects so typical of 19th century, but very soon the fictional and poetic, translated into a pleasant way, became wholly Western fashionable, so that in Europe many painters who bordered on symbolism did not indulge in it, not because of a sincere modernism trend, but because their compositions were found to be pleasing an audience that was ready to be seduced more by the direct hedonism of those affectionate creations than by the deepest concerns raised by the most authentic symbolism. And this was a trend that attracted several other painters, such as Josep Triadó, who would soon become a foremost figure of the Catalan modernist graphic arts. Sebastià Junyent, besides being a painter, was one of the most rigorous intellectuals of that time in Catalonia through his writings, where he encouraged the new generation artists, and also a collector and patron, among others, of the young Pablo Picasso, whom he helped generously at the beginning of this painter. As a painter, Junyent might have been a little erratic, but he had always a great self-sufficiency, and in his most symbolist paintings, like all the others, he showed his levels of authenticity. He had a younger brother, Oleguer Junyent, also a painter, but who stood out more as a successful decorator and set designer. Joaquim Vancells, basically a landscaper and a patriarch of the active modernist group of the city of Terrassa, used to transpose symbolist aesthetics into a context of nature with often breathtaking compositions full of mystery. The symbolist influence was not ephemeral on Catalan art, and younger artists had a major role there. There is the case of Adrià Gual, another multi-purpose first-class artist, painter, designer, playwright, stage designer, and one of the first filmmakers in the country, who as a plastic artist reached perhaps the most outstanding achievements of symbolist modernism in Catalonia, although it is in the field of theatre where he is considered a fundamental figure. Especially in the last decade in the 19th century and the first one of the 20th, many painters were attracted by symbolism, like Lluís Masriera, another multi-purpose first-class artist, who besides as a painter also was valued as a playwright and above all as the great jeweler of Catalan modernism. This jewel that represents the first fly of a plane in Barcelona, in fact, was done in 1905, 4 years before this flight really took place. It was prophetic. Gaspar Camps would also be an excellent representative of symbolist influence, both at home and in France, where he was a very active poster artist for years, although in him Art Nouveau fashion had more weight than surely the intellectual background that impelled the defenders of symbolism as a cultural movement. Later on, however, symbolism no longer had the very strong presence it had shown at the turn of the century, and many artists evolved towards other trends. Some of them, nevertheless, remained always very close to the solemn and emphatic concept of painting, such as Josep Maria Xiró. Another one, Pau Roig, as a young man, was in charge of the mural decorations of the Caçador i Moreu music store in Barcelona, and he solved it with 3 panels of a highly typical symbolism modernism. Afterwards, perhaps, he noticed that in Catalonia there were no real possibilities of improving his status, since there were many other elder and established painters, and he went to Paris, where he drew near the style of Toulouse-Lautrec before spending many years dedicated not only to oil but also to etching. Mayol aside, the special political situation in the northern part of Catalonia, integrated in France since the Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659, turned their children into French citizens. And this seemingly only administrative obstacle was strong enough to keep Catalan artists quite disconnected on both sides of the border. The most powerful northern Catalan artist of this generation, Aristides Mallol, will become one of the world's greatest sculptors of this time. And here in the Meadows there are a very important sculptor of him. But he had just begun a painter. The initial Mallol through the 90s was one of the main members of the group of the Navys formed in Paris next to Bonnard, Vuillard or Maurice Denis, representatives of a variant of the pictorial symbolism which they painted within a bold post-impressionism, often synthesized with intense and luminous colors. Personal figures. Louis Graner was a painter with a realistic root who loved the great contrasts of light in the shade, and on the other hand, an enterprising fan of great innovation and highly recognized performing shows. Antoni Gaudí, a friend of him, designed one of the showrooms open for him, but unfortunately it has not been preserved. He embarked on an American adventure through Brazil and the United States, where interesting works by him are being kept, such the one at the Meadows Museum. And we can never leave aside people such as Francesc Gimeno, a sniper personally detached from the modernist centers, but who cultivated a very energetic painting also of realistic root and loose brushstroke, which with his individual strength escapes from conventionalism, although it would not be recognized in all his magnitude until it was accepted by painters, critics and collectors of late generations. Like Graner, Gimeno did tone up with Gaudí, and some of his buildings, the Sagrada Familia, the Teresians, the Güell Park, were the subjects of paintings by Gimeno. Güell. An exceptional circumstance in modernist painting, because curiously few other Catalan painters of that generation did feel quite attracted to such radically original architecture to be inspired by it in their creations. The Cercle de Sant Lluc. The members of the central core of art modernism belonged to the Cercle Artístic of Barcelona, an organization that was often more recreational than doctrinal, and tending towards hedonism. This caused a group of artists who felt affected by Catholic morality and did not like what they thought to be frivolous. So they decided to found a new artistic platform in accordance to their ideas. They call it Cercle Artístic de Sant Lluc and started in 1893. The soul of the new Cercle, sponsored by the future Bishop of Vic, the outstanding theoretical writer Josep Torres i Bages, was the painter Joan Llimona, who took part 50-50 in the naturalist line and the symbolist one, but always by placing a Christian accent directly or indirectly on his works. In a way, Llimona was not far from the art of Maurice Denis, only the works of the Catalan did not reach the degree of modernity exhibited by the French painter. his brother, the sculptor Josep Llimona, or the architect Antoni Gaudí, were also initiators of the Cercle de Sant Lluc, which included many more painters such as Riquer, Graner, Vancells, Arcadi Mas, Gimeno, who entered later on, Masriera, Xiró. Not always, however, the members of Sant Lluc shared the Catholic values of the founders. Many became partners, attracted especially by the artistic rigor that was required by the organization. Dionís Baixeras was another of the most relevant painters of Cercle de Sant Lluc and one of its founding members. He painted the working life of fishermen and peasants, seen through a friendly naturalism which often evokes Christian resignation. Although less active in the staff of the Cercle, Felix Masters was one of the most frequent painters in the exhibitions and very connected to the spirit of the organization. His paintings, which was that of a distinguished professor, later director of the official Barcelona School of Fine Arts, was an excellent example of the trend towards the juste milieu, those who were open to certain modes of modernism but nuanced with a contained academic correction. The Post Modernists. After the first modernist wave, there came another one made up of younger painters. Stimulated by the novelty represented by the strict modernists, they took advantage of the path they had opened for them and went even further in their search for new ideas. That is why they would follow the Paris Post-Impressionists, and they would even create new languages in a bold way that is often being compared to that Europe's more inanquiet colleagues. In the most direct sense of the word, these painters would also be modernists. Perhaps they are most worthy of being so named due to the higher and far-standing degree that their modernity showed. Although for the general public, modernism has been identified above all with the forms close to what has been called Art Nouveau. This trend, on the other hand, was no longer interested in postmodernists, especially since Art Nouveau, or modern style, had won such widespread popularity everywhere since the Universal Exhibition of Paris in 1900, which was seen by the more rigorous creators already as a plastic resource which, after its enormous initial impact, had become a vulgarized victim of his own popular success. The most prominent of these postmodernist painters was Hermen Anglada Camarasa, due to the originality and the magnitude of his international career. However, he was also the most uprooted, since neither in his beginnings nor in his fullness did he take much part in the Catalan cultural life, where everything was coming and passing. Anglada was a solitary man, not very close to contemporary painters, who, after a great effort to open his way in Barcelona through an individual exhibition at the Sala Parés in 1894, consisting in magnificent landscapes of the mountainous area of the Montseny, in a meticulous naturalism, he decided to go to Paris to try his luck as a perfectly anonymous painter. There, after a few years of misery, he managed to define an extremely personal style. related to the Nabis wall, in which the form dissolved, leaving only the prominence of color, of glittering combinations, the battle horse of the most broken painting of Western art at that time. He placed that aesthetic conception at the service of paintings that had the thematic pretext in the world of frivolous nightlife in Paris, and later on gypsy dances that could show a marked expressionism. With that Anglada Camarasa style, he was suddenly projected into the walls since 1900, and there marking the condition to exhibit his best pictures in France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Belgium, Russia, avoiding competition, prizes and medals that the great majority of painters persecuted with insistence, and which he didn't require to be accepted by modern art lovers around the world. His presence in Barcelona, back in Sala Parés in 1900, has been one of the most powerful impacts on Catalan painting at the time. Among his achievements, there is, after all, the awakening of Parisian modernity in the young Picasso, who had not yet begun to define what would be his capital career in 20th century wall art. The outbreak of the First World War led him to repatriate himself, and so Anglada, he preferred to set up his definitive home in Mallorca's Port de Pollença. Anglada's work at Meadows is one of several oil notes that the painter made live in the Paris nightclubs he frequented around 1900. Anglada's loneliness is a special case, since many of the post-modernists were part of groups and circles from where they could end up being projected in a few years. A few were from a group known as the Colla del Safrà in the mid-90s, in which the cadmium tones of their landscapes emerged. Among these painters from the Colla del Safrà, there is one, Ramón Pichot, who would connect very closely with a post-modernist artist. Much younger than he, Pablo Picasso, Pichot approached symbolist sensibility triumphantly in Europe with a post-impressionist make that had discovered the world of gypsies with Rossinyol in Granada in 1898. The gypsies could wake up in Pichot the attraction for social marginalization that several other Catalan postmodernist painters also felt, but it must be also remembered that the painter lived from his art, and that time in Paris, where Pichot was closely established, the art market, even the more modern ones, welcomed Hispanic exoticism. What we could call the myth of Carmen by Mérimée and Bizet was there still very much alive, and if the painters could combine the aesthetic and social desires with the demands of the market, it was logically better for their survival. Soon, Pichot would also include Catalan subjects like sardana dances in l'Empordà country, to which he was very well linked. Eventually, he was one of the forgers of the modern myth of the artistic village of Cadaqués. Anyway, his work never falls into the anecdotal folkloric style so common among late commercial heirs of 19th century customism. And at the beginning of the new century, he became so close to the most renovating pictorial circles in France that he exhibited his works in the same hall at the Parisian Salon d'Automne, where the revolution of the Fauves exploded in 1905. Pichot was then, even temporarily, one of the members of the Cage of Fauves, the box of the wild beasts, the name which the most conservative art critics baptized successfully this which is considered the first avant-garde pictorial school in of the 20th century. Another of the great names of the Colla del Safrà was Isidre Nonell, attracted by the wall of the most extern marginalization cretins that he saw in the Bois Valley in 1896. Defeated soldiers repatriated from the Cuban War, mutilated people, beggars, gypsies, etc. Nonell brought these difficult issues to Paris, where he had some echo in the last 4 years of 19th century, when he came to exhibit at the gallery of the art dealer Ambroise Bollard, later famous promoter of the great figures of Post-Impressionism, Fauvism, and the first avant-garde. Back in Barcelona, already in the new century, Nonell imposed an almost unique subject, the canvases representing gypsies, which he depicted without any temptation of the picturesque and with a trace derived from Daumier or perhaps Van Gogh. This wager, which had nothing to do with Spanish topicality, earned him a high degree of misunderstanding, even among some of modernist art critics, but he didn't bother and would be the leader and of the young Catalan painting until his very early death in 1911. Nonell's childhood partner and also a member of Colla del Safrà, Joaquim Mir, developed a very different career in a maximum of modern creativity. Above all a landscaper, Mir met Rossinyol in Mallorca, where with brief lapses he was the first 4 years of 20th century. But the presence of the expansive great master of modernism, Rossinyol, enraged him, and then he decided to climb alone the cliffs of the northern part of the island of Mallorca, which opened up a whole range of plastic and vital possibilities embodied in a large canvases painted there with violent stains that seemed to lose sight of figuration. Despite being in Mallorca, what he was doing was known as balut in Barcelona through exhibitions, but his isolation and the turbulent and wild life he was leading there developed into a severe nervous crisis that forced Mir to be rescued and admitted to the psychiatric hospital in Reus in 1905. And his painting, so ambitious and uncomfortable, magnificently original and often splendid, was created without ever setting foot in Paris, then the Mecca of modern art. Mir's main piece in the Meadows collection is a Leafy Plant allegory full of color, a project for one of the murals of his uncle Felix Trinxet's house. Oils that were ripped off the walls and chopped off when the house was sadly demolished in the 60s. And this is a comparison here, and this is the only photograph I know of the original state of this mural painting, because nowadays it's conserved but cut in different parts. It's a crime, but it was. But this is the. And this one of Meadows is the sketch, more than a sketch, because it's very, very complete, of this part of the decoration of Felix Trinxet's house. Another one work here in Meadows Museum is this landscape of the village, the L'Alforja, painted in 1926. L'Alforja is a village near Tarragona. The itinerary of Ricard Canals, another member of the Colla del Safrà, was very different. Nonells made in Boí, and especially in Paris, he exhibited in salons and interesting galleries with less thematic aggressiveness than his friend, however. He fell there in the orbit of Durand Ruel, who had been the great art dealer of the French Impressionism. And thanks to this, he was promoted in France and even in the United States with works that, close to Renoir, had to be located in Andalusia, where he traveled at the expense of the merchants, who were fascinated by a pseudo-Moorish Spain that a certain kind of travelers of a romantic age had popularized some decades ago. A friend of Canals, she made his portrait, but not a member of the Colla del Safrà, was Louisa Vidal, without a doubt the best Catalan woman painter of the modernist era. At a time when mainly women painters were almost exclusively dedicated to making flower canvases, Louisa Vidal painted all sorts of subjects, went through Paris, and was also dedicated to literary and magazine illustrations. Besides, she was part of a family clan of great cultural importance in the country. Like her father, Francesc de Paula Vidal was the great interior designer of his time, and Pau Casals, the musician, Manuel de Montoliu, literary critic, or Oleguer Junyent, artist, were lovers or husbands of her sisters. Although not everyone mentions Joaquim Sunyer as if he had been member of the Colla del Safrà, his personal proximity and in his classrooms to the most well-known of its members place him in the same orbit of the group. In Paris, Sunyer changed his style, but always within modernity, Post-Impressionism, halfway between Steinlen and Bonnard, who kept him in what was here called Modernism, still far away from the Sunyer triumphant in Catalonia some years later. when he became the paradigmatic painter of a new pictorial style called noucentisme. Post-Modernists from another origin were the former members of the Rovell de l'Ou group, literally the Yolk group, trained at the Barcelona Art School of Pere Borrell del Caso, with whom Gual or Canals also studied. Xavier Nogués, another of the disciples of Borrell and a member of the mentioned group, was never placed near modernism, but would later be one of the most important figures of the new cultural already mentioned trend of the noucentisme. The elder Borrell was an orthodox realist painter and imbued his disciples with a doctrine that was militantly attentive to the faithful descriptions of things. However, the main members of the aforementioned group, Marián Pi de la Serra and Pere Isern, had been spending a long, intense and almost epiphany season in Paris in 1899-1901, where they abandoned strict realism and were seduced by Impressionism, becoming in fact the first Catalan exponents fully attached to that so outstanding current of European modern art of the time. This is Pere Isern, the other member of this group. That stage in Paris, in the attic of a house in the Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, in the Latin Quarter, which they shared with the sculptor Emili Fontbona, also a colleague of them at the Borrell Academy, has a lot to do with the myth of Parisian bohemians, who had recently been the fashion due to the opera by Puccini, La Bohème. Well, this is a photograph made by myself from this atelier, La Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, and the version made by Pi de la Serra and the version made by Pere Isern. Pi de la Serra made a lot of different versions with snow and with sun and with rain, a little like Monet made his landscapes. The individual exhibitions that both Pi de la Serra and Isern showed in Barcelona when returning from Paris, that same year, 1901, and Pi de la Serra in 1902, had especially, that of the Pi de la Serra, very powerful impact on the Catalan artistic world, and a contribution in novelty that makes these painters to be undoubtedly classified within the great plural wave of modernism in its most innovative version. Isern would return to Paris, where a good part of his life would be established. There he would find a subject, that of classical or folklorical dancers, which would give him, along with other subjects, a good commercial outlet. Pi de la Serra, on the other hand, soon left Impressionism, in which he had done magnificent works to approach an expressive and personal primitivism stubbornly maintained despite producing a certain rejection for his harshness among an important part of the public. Josep Maria Sert was also trained by Borrell, but his career does not have much in common with that of his colleagues or with any other Catalan painter of his generation. In the central years of modernism, Sartre's work was scarce and poorly known. However, when the Great Paris Universal Exhibition of 1900 took place, but he already was there at the stand of Samuel Byng, which he named Art Nouveau, which thus baptized the decorative style of an entire time, as if he, Sartre, were almost a consecrated artist. Young member of the Cercle de Sant Lluc, but at the same time son of an ennobled family of makers of tapestries and carpets, and a man of refined tastes, was allowed by Bishop Torres y Bages to make big murals in the big cathedral. He never finished the first part of this. They are extant since they were on canvas. They are a most modernist realization, although of an unusual type in Catalonia, overwhelming, colossal, but with a certain echo of the synthetist Navi with which he had contact in France. His later career was glittering and around the world, always focusing on murals, but he was then escaping from modernism. Of this later age are the sketches kept and the of his later age are the sketches kept here at the Meadows for the murals of the League of Nations in Geneva. There are other post-modernists who didn't take part in any of the organized groups, but did also astonish onlookers by the personal and advanced responses they gave to evolutionary line of Catalan painting of the moment. Nicola Rubric is one of the most obvious ones. He was trained at the Llotja, the official school of fine arts, and he was a student of my friend and extended his studies to Rome on his own, but he always maintained a high degree of independence. Although he didn't disdain approaching the Spanish official art channels, he developed a very surprising style based on thick feelings which can shape large, purely material areas, and a certain barbarism of make. His affiliation to modernism is not only based on his quest for a new style that is far from conventionalism, but also because of the intellectual attitude that draws him to be inspired in one of his most important works by the exceptional novel Solitude by Victor Català, in reality a female writer, without falling into the temptation of reflecting the anecdote. Ricard Turgell would be somewhat marginally in the same postmodernist section. He was the son of the great landscaper of late Romanticism, Modest Turgell, who at one time was one of the most valued teachers by the most demanding young students. Ricard was Anglada Camarasa's friend of childhood, and he cultivated, like him, a faded color, often with artificial lights, which nevertheless keeps a very personal line. The same wall of frivolous Paris that served as a pretext for Anglada to develop his personal use of color was also addressed by Xavier Gosset. only that this one, with an elegant refinement, was more attached to illustration, graphic press, and the fashion wall. That is not about easel painting, although he did not refrain from doing some personal exhibitions. This set him aside from the many other Catalan artists of Paris, more inclined towards bohemian life, while he, like Anglada himself, who has works of Gauguin in his art collection, enjoyed an important life train. The youngest of the post-modernists was Pablo Picasso. He was to become the world's greatest painter of the 20th century. Despite having been born in Malaga and having passed through Galicia, in the wake of his father's career, José Ruiz Blasco, who was an official professor of fine arts, he found in Barcelona from 1955 on a creative environment, the modernist, much more suggestive to him than the great compositions and the most academic techniques he used to make at home. Picasso felt influenced by all the stimuli of modernism. It's the sketches that he did of modernist colleagues in Barcelona. And he was not reduced to reproducing them, but he assimilated them to create quickly new personal and successive styles that were very different from those that were commonly seen. That's why he was first fascinated by Casas and Rossinyol, and a bit later he approached the men of Colla del Safrà, but he never stayed there. After seeing the impressive exhibition by Anglada Camarasa at Sala Parés in May of 1900, he left the most modern Post-Impressionism, the one that most forgot the precise and balanced forms. And when arriving in Paris, for the first time at the end of that year, he had already shaped a personal version of the most modern pictorial style that was being done at that time in Europe. His jumping to the most avant-garde art internationally was very fast. He was still reading between Barcelona and Paris, going through the Blue Period, which was a version of the sharpest symbolism, and once definitively settled in Paris, after his Pink Period, he created Cubism in 1907, which he had matured during a stay in Gósol, a village near the Catalan Pyrenees. Also, Picasso was a product of modernist Barcelona, and from there he projected to the wall, leaving behind all his links to modernism. And for finishing, the Meadows Museum also has drawings and etchings by a slightly younger Catalan artist, but still close to modernism, Ismael Smith, who died precisely in the United States. I will no longer extend myself. Modernism then was a not too long time of Catalan art and culture. In fact, we can consider it lasting for about 25 years. But it was very intense. The density and variety of authors and successful works, and especially the high degree of modernity they exhibited, showed that the Catalan life that had generated such an art had been set at the level of the most ambitious and innovative trends of Europe, as had never been strong in our country since the Middle Ages. Modernism means the overcoming of the provincialism in which Catalonia had been immersed by its low-level political situation within a centralist, decadent, and centralized Spain. And although although it is true that the most modern Catalanist achievements were architectural, Gaudí and Domènech i Muntaner especially, the level was also in the field of painting very high, as we have seen. Thank you.
So I think maybe just one or two questions.
Well, I don't hear well, but Cal Ferrat of Sitges, it's the house that Santiago Rossinyol built in an old house of Sitges, and he complete with pieces of medieval sculptures, and an architect, a good architect of the time, Francesc Fontbona, that dies very young, was the man that built this Cau Ferrat. And the Cau Ferrat was not only the atelier and the house of Rossinyol, but the artist organized there a lot of fests, of concerts, exhibitions, lectures. Many of his friends, artists, even European ones, were at Cau Ferrat to play his concerts and to represent his playwrights. And well, I don't know.
I think this is what you're asking, right? You were asking if the photos were in Rossinyol's. Does Rossinyol's house serve as a gallery as well for other exhibitions?
Yes. Well, it's open. When Rossinyol dies in the 30s, Cau Ferrat was left to the I don't know exactly if the municipality of Sitges, but nowadays is a museum. It's had been maintained like in life of Rossinyol, and it's a very curious and there is a good collection, because many artists were the work of many artists, friends of Rossinyol, are represented there.
Have one more question? No? Yes, sorry, right in front of me.
Well, this kind of movements had never a date concrete of. In the architecture, there are chief masters of Gaudí very later. Sagrada Família, Gaudí dies in 1926, and he was still building Sagrada Família, but La Pedrera, that is one of the most important buildings of Gaudí, is 1906, and Palau de la Música, the Domènech i Montaner, is 1908. But in that time, the modernism painters was also in decadence and began a new generation. The architecture and the painting were not in the same rhythm. And it's considered that in 1911 began a new movement, that is this movement of noucentisme, that their representatives were positively against the modernists, as is usual in successive movements. But a conventional date would be the 11.
One last one.
Yes, the 98 generation is mainly a literary movement. There are some artists that also participate of the, but it's very different because it's complicated, because in the generation of 98 is a movement of whose center was Madrid, and is a Spanish movement, and this modernism is Barcelona or Catalan movement. Yes, it's parallel in the time, but it's very different. But the thing is still more complicated if we have if we consider that in Madrid there was also a modernism, a movement called modernism. It was the literary one, not artistic. Rubén Darío, Juan Ramón Jiménez, Valle Inclán, but in fact is a question of similitude of names, but are not the same profound thing. It's a little complicated, and always, I I directed some years ago 5 volumes of modernism art, Catalan art, and I asked a specialist of literary modernism Spanish that made a chapter precisely for put the consideration of these similar names. And even in the religion, there were also an heretical movement called modernism at the same time. And it was any relationship with the Spanish modernism, with the Catalan modernism, and in the world, modernism is another thing. It's modernity. Well, the art history and culture history are not exact science.
Sounds like we need to start saying modernisms with an S.
Yes. Yes.
With that, would you join me in thanking?
Thank you very much.